My name is Bob Rosen.
Good morning, my name is Emma-Kate Swann. It's an absolute pleasure to be here this morning with you.
I don't know about you, but I feel we are witnessing one of the most interesting times, at least in my career. More change, more challenges, more opportunities than ever before. We're being asked to perform in real time at the same time that we have to transform our organizations. So today, Emma-Kate and I are going to talk about what we believe is the most important personal leadership capability inside our organizations today, being grounded and conscious. These ideas are based on 30 years of research, of advising executives, and facilitating workshops around the world. It's critical today that we look at what are the important mindsets and skills required to actually survive and thrive in a disruptive and accelerating world. As organizational psychologists, you know as well as I do that the world is changing faster than our ability to adapt. So let's jump in and take a look at 4 leaders. The first one is Mary Barra. The company was bankrupt, General Motors, and she took on the job. And as soon as she got into the job, 30 million cars were recalled. And Mary had to invest in the innovation and the transformation of General Motors. Reed Hastings started Netflix in 1997. He actually disrupted that company and changed their business model 3 times over the next 20 years. Angela Ahrendts was the CEO of Burberry. And then she came to Apple to become the SVP of retail, fundamentally changing the sales experience to compete with Google and Amazon and Samsung. And then you have Hamdi Ulukaya, the CEO and founder of Chobani, who came to the United States as a Turkish immigrant in 1997, and he built the largest yogurt company in the United States today. Now, what is unique about these 4 leaders is that not only did they transform their organizations, but they transformed themselves. Now, one of the interesting challenges to think about is that we are all grappling with the same 6 disruptors. The pace of speed, forcing us to see, think, feel, and act faster. The importance of impermanence and uncertainty, where stability is an illusion and uncertainty is reality. Every time we breathe, the world changes. How do we deal with all of this unpredictability? Complexity is requiring a more complex mind, more choices, the Internet of Things, data analytics, forcing us to think much bigger than ever before. Technology is the ultimate uber disruptor, affecting our personal lives and our business lives. Competition coming from everywhere, and so how do we balance our desire for meaning at the same time, our passion to win and to achieve and to be successful? And then finally, the whole issue of globalization. We're connected more than ever before, and despite the politics and the tensions in the global regulation arena, we actually are doing business together as one globe and living as one planet more than ever. What this is requiring is that all of us transform. So if we want our organizations to transform, every person in our organizations have to transform. And that is our learning adaptive challenge moving forward. Now, we just did a Harris survey where we went out and we asked 2,200 working adults, how well are leaders adapting to change? And we found that only 13% of those respondents said that leaders are doing a great job. And in fact, almost 60% said that they're doing a fair to poor job of leading change and transformation and adapting to these new realities. So what are some of the consequences? Well, the first is that many CEOs are worried about the lack of change readiness inside their business and the slow business transformation that's occurring. Secondly is the recent net promoter scores in this country are actually going down, not up, and that increasingly customers are feeling underwhelmed by the service that they're being offered. There are major gaps between the leaders and people that we have and the leaders and people that we need. Many organizations are concerned these days about the increasing stress and burnout in institutions. And in fact, the big challenge is how do we humanly execute all of this transformation that's going on? And as soon as you get one technology disruption, another one comes on board as the engagement and collaboration is pretty challenging in our teams as we reinvent virtual and face-to-face teams in a new technology-oriented society. We believe that the secret to grappling with these business challenges is being grounded and conscious. Grounded leadership is the foundation. It helps us stay rooted in a world that is disruptive and constantly changing. Conscious is the accelerant, the fuel that drives us forward and accelerates our ability to adapt and change. So let's put this in one business context. Grounded and conscious shines a light on who we are as individuals that dictates or translates how we show up in the world, our actions and our practices, and ultimately leads to how we perform, the performance metrics at the back end. So let me give you one quick example. I coach CEOs for a living. And one of the things that struck me over 30 years is that the best CEOs are deeply self-aware, and they are committed to their own development. And it's this mindset that enables them to see that their value chain of finances and marketplace and operations is driven by their human agenda, the purpose of the business, the values, the leadership, and the culture of the business. And because they are self-aware and committed to their own development, they understand why it's so important to prioritize the human agenda. And they understand why it's so important to back chief learning officers and CHROs and the human strategy in their organization. So that's why grounded and conscious is so important. Emma-Kate.
Thank you, Bob. So we all remember too well last year Hurricane Harvey that devastated this city of Houston. And if we think about the number of trees that were uprooted all over the city. Now, if we think about the trees that were actually able to withstand the storm, those were the trees that were most strongly rooted. And we like to use this same metaphor of a rooted tree to think about grounded leaders. What you have above the ground is what you can see, the branches and the leaves, and this is what we refer to as what you do. But it's what's beneath the surface. It's the roots that help it in a windstorm to remain resilient, and this is what we refer to as who you are. It's who you are as a healthy human being. Our research has found that the way we define who you are is 6 dimensions of grounded leadership. And those leaders who focus on developing these 6 grounded roots are much more resilient and able to deal with the stresses and strains of a constantly changing world. So what's different about our approach to grounded leadership to other leadership perspectives? Well, most of us have grown up with a paradigm of what you do drives who you are. So what's the first thing people ask you at a party? What do you do? Okay? In Washington, D.C., I don't sound like I'm from Washington, D.C., I'm originally from Sydney, Australia. But the first thing I was asked, I'm in my 40s and someone says, so what school do you go to? I'm like, what school did I go to? That was a long time ago. So I don't know if that's a DC thing, but it's often a question people ask, what do we do, what school do we go to? And in the context of leadership, we often focus on what you do in terms of skills and competencies and external metrics. Now, this approach to developing our leaders is having a mixed scorecard. So we're getting inconsistent and unsustainable performance. We believe that we need to turn this paradigm on its head and focus on who you are. Who you are drives what you do and how you perform. So what is grounded leadership? Grounded leadership is made up of 6 dimensions of health. Physical health is how you live. Emotional health, how you feel. Intellectual health is how you think. Social health is about your interactions, your ability to work in teams. Vocational health is how you perform. And spiritual health is how you view the world. So this is a holistic and integrative approach to developing our leaders. Each of these dimensions interact with each other. So if we neglect any particular dimension, our research shows that your performance is impacted. So let's start with physical health. Why are physical roots so important to operate in an accelerating and disruptive world? Well, our physical roots is what deals directly with the speed and change in which we're having to operate. So for me, physical health is absolutely foundational. Now, I don't particularly like getting up every morning at 5 a.m. to work out before my day job, but I know that if I don't, I won't have the energy, stamina, and focus I need in order to perform at my highest level.
And she makes me completely guilty every single day.
I do, I
at 5.
can't help it. So, in terms of the roots that make up physical health, you can see there's 3: body, mind awareness, energy management, and peak performance lifestyle. So body, mind, and awareness, if you think about what we learned yesterday, mindfulness practices, so starting to be aware of how our mind and body are connected and paying attention to those signals our body gives us when we're starting to burn out, to take care of ourselves. One of the key coaching issues I deal with executives is burnout, and they often don't want to admit it in the workplace because it looks like they're not resilient enough. Energy management, this is really a reframe on time management. We teach leaders that in order to better manage your time, you've got to manage your energy. You only have so much energy. So thinking about yourself like a corporate athlete, and there's a lot of work that the corporate athlete have done around this as well, around how are you building in rest and renewal into your day in order to be at your best. And then finally, peak performance lifestyle are those day-to-day habits like diet, exercise, and we're all learning a lot about the impact of sleep on our ability to think clearly. So one of the people who is a great model for strong physical roots is Dennis Nally, the former global CEO of PricewaterhouseCoopers. And Bob coached Dennis for a number of years, and I actually came originally to the US to work on PricewaterhouseCoopers' Global Leadership Development Program, where he was a great role model. So Dennis, as you can imagine, in a global role, has to travel all the time. And one of the things that he does is that he gauges with his teams when he could push them and when he needed to slow down the pace. And he liked to think of life as like a stool with 3 legs. So we have one leg, which is our family, one that's our work, and one that's our personal hobbies. And if any one of those legs is not balanced, our whole system is impacted and our performance spirals down. So the interesting thing about Dennis, who had a huge role, as you can imagine, he committed to taking 4 days off every month to spend time on his boat, right? To rest and renew himself. So one of the questions I have for you is, what are you doing for yourself in terms of managing your own physical health to prevent burnout? And what are your leaders doing in order to address that to be at their best?
So uncertainty and impermanence drives the need for emotional health. This is about how we feel. It starts with being self-aware, really deeply understanding our strengths and our vulnerabilities and shortcomings. Then we have to live in our positive emotions. It's amazing that we're finding out in neuroscience that we are hardwired for fear-based emotions. Anger, sadness, anxiety, disgust, shame, you know them very well, I suspect. But what we're finding out in most recent years is we're also hardwired for the positive emotions, like hope and faith and generosity and empathy and compassion and, yes, love. And the really, really good leaders, they experience and express the full range of their emotions, but they course correct quickly into their positive emotions. And then finally is the whole area of resilience. There's more threat in this disruptive world. We get hijacked into our survival brains, and so we have to really begin to understand how that threat shows up in our body. We also have to live more in positive emotions and to bounce back quickly. I was sitting in London, and I was having lunch with a lovely guy from Chile, and they introduced the lunchtime speaker. And he kindly excused himself, and he walked up to the front of the room, and he mesmerized the audience. And he told us about a story that he and a bunch of rugby players, along with his mom and sister, were flying over the Andes, and their plane went down. Remember the story of Alive? Well, this is the story of Nando Parato. And Nando Parato taught me a lot about the importance of our emotional health. He told me that it's critical to take risks, to not be afraid. He told me it's important to live in the moment rather than the past or the future that we often get hijacked by. It's very important to follow your heart and to never stop changing. Now, you don't have to fall down into the Andes to understand these critical capabilities, but in an uncertain world, we need to teach our people about the power of emotional health. Intellectual health is driven by complexity. We need more complex minds to deal with a more complex world. It starts with deep curiosity. But you know, it's very interesting. What happens is between 25 and 40, Swedish researchers have said, maybe I think it's 25 and 45, at a time when our professional colleagues need to be changing and transforming more, we're the least resistant to change, because we have kids and we have financial responsibilities and community responsibilities, but that's the time that we need them to do the most leadership development. So we're pushing up against a real challenge, is that people really don't want to change, oftentimes in the middle of their careers. Much more change at the front end and at the back end when people want to retire or they're in the last phases of their work life. Secondly, we need to help cultivate an adaptive mindset, being able to look at our mental assumptions and our business models and the way we see problems, to turn them on their head and look at them with fresh eyes. And finally, we need to live and lead with paradoxical thinking. You know, many of us grew up in a world of either or black and white thinking, linear thinking, and you solved problems. But in today, we have to live in paradoxes, and we have to learn how to think in both and thinking. And there's a chapter in Conscious, actually, that deals with just that. So I met Jorgen, who was the CEO of Lego in New York some years ago, and he had just taken on the challenge of leading Lego. And anybody know where the headquarters of Lego is? Denmark. And what was interesting was he believed that he had to fundamentally change the collective mindset of Lego. So you know where he went out to learn that? He went out and he hired an anthropologist, and he went out and studied their core customer. Who's their core customer? Kids. And he watched as kids built Lego blocks. They looked at the blocks from multiple angles. They made sort of mental hypotheses in their minds about what happens if I put a block here, what happens if I put a block there. And he brought those insights into the organization, and he fundamentally changed the way Lego thinks. And so now we have Lego stores and we have Lego movies, and that was the source of innovation. He invested in the intellectual health of that workforce.
So we're living in a world of increasing cynicism, mistrust, and polarization. Do you agree? Yeah, I'm seeing a few head nods there. So what I'm about to talk about now is social health, the importance of social health. Because on the one hand, we have this increasing cynicism and mistrust, but on the other hand, we're actually very connected by our social relationships. Our social relationships are like social electricity. So we energize and de-energize each other, and there's some science around this. At the same time, our relationships are getting even more complicated because we have the blending of human beings with digital machines. So the need to focus on building deep connections and collaboration is so much more important. Now, Bob mentioned Angela Ahrendts at the beginning in his opening remarks, and Angela is a great example of social health. She demonstrates authenticity, mutually rewarding relationships, and builds nourishing communities. So prior, as Bob mentioned, she was the CEO at Burberry and then went on to be the Senior Vice President at Apple for their retail area. And she was the first woman executive on their team, as well as the first person to be charged with the huge task of having to expand their digital shopping experience. Now, Angela has a belief that you need to start by building relationships with your employees before focusing on your customers. And at a TEDx talk in Hollywood in 2013, she talked about grounded leadership. At the core is a sense of love. So love of your employees and really tapping into what they love. And one of the things her previous COO confirmed as her key strength was her ability to unleash human energy. And she did this simply by telling her people how important they were and how important they were to the team. We then move on to vocational health, and one of the speakers yesterday talked about the importance of meaning in our work, and a meaningful calling is one aspect that we talk about in vocational health. Now, Indra Nooyi is a wonderful example of someone who has strong vocational roots. If you know anything about Indra Nooyi, she is currently the CEO of PepsiCo, and in a world where gender discrimination is across the board, she's someone who stepped into, the fourth largest company in their most senior role, so a great American success story. She grew up in a conservative Indian family. She was born in 1955. And growing up, her mother used to ask her and her sister, "What would you like to do when you grow up?" And she would then award the sister who gave the best response. So Indra spent a lot of time reflecting on this question of a meaningful calling, one of the key aspects that we talk about in vocational health. And it's about finding a match between your values and your talents and focusing on something that gives you energy and helps you step into your full potential. The other aspects that Indra focuses on is her drive to succeed and her personal mastery. And this really supported her after she got a postgraduate degree in India. She came to the US with very little money and she went to Yale School of Management. In order to support her studies, she worked as a receptionist from midnight to sunrise. She then moved through the ranks of PepsiCo and became the president and CFO and today the CEO. And tomorrow she actually steps down in her role as the CEO. But she has inspired women and girls around the world, and I think she's a great example of how important it is that all levels of our organisation, all employees, practice such strong vocational roots.
The last root is spiritual health, which is how we see the world. And this is driven by globalization. Now, the whole concept of spirituality is a confusing and amorphous one. Some people associate it with religion, a lot of people in the United States, but if you go to Northern Europe, they don't like to talk about spirituality, but they're fundamentally good people. So we define spirituality in 3 ways. 1, do you have a higher purpose? It's actually really important. I didn't find my higher purpose until I was 50. I used to come into these rooms and want to be perceived as a smart kid, a smart guy on the block. And then I suddenly realized that my higher purpose is to help people be a little bigger and a little better than I found them. And I suddenly changed my whole outlook of going in the room. I want to help you be bigger and better so you walk out of here a little different than when you came in today. A total shift in my higher purpose. Secondly is global, and by the way, higher purpose people and higher purpose companies outperform their competitors. Secondly is generosity, is global connectedness. Are we part of something bigger than ourselves? One of the dilemmas is that our world is becoming more polarized, more self-interested, more partisan at a very time that we need to be recognizing that we are connected in the world in one planet and connected by humanity, that we're all similar and we're all different. So global connectedness is the foundation for diversity. It's the foundation for social responsibility. It's the foundation for environmental stewardship. We all go up and go down together. That's a very, very important insight to have when we're trying to get our arms around spiritual health. And lastly is generosity of spirit. As Mike talked about, gratitude and generosity are so essential, and they are very important qualities to people who are happier, more fulfilled, and more successful. So I love the story of Paul Pullman. Anybody know what company he's the CEO of? Unilever. And they're headquartered in Holland, in Amsterdam, I think in Rotterdam, and in London. I think they just moved their headquarters to the Netherlands, their single headquarters. Paul's a very interesting guy. He came into Unilever and he decided to work in that company because of the purpose of that business. And he came in, and the first speech that he gave, he said, you know, to be a great leader, you first and foremost have to be a great human being. So he has lots of attitudes that are very different from a lot of CEOs. He basically believes that business should serve society rather than society serving business. He believes that business needs to think in the short and the long term. And if you're not thinking in the long term and creating long-term value creation for all of your stakeholders, you're not doing your job. So when Kraft and Heinz decided to impose a hostile takeover on Unilever, he invited all of his stakeholders to help, and he was able to fight back that because he had built strong covenants with his stakeholders over time. So there you have it. The 18 roots, the 6 dimensions of being a grounded leader. As Emma-Kate said, it is an integrated, holistic leadership system. There are thousands of books and experts in any one of these 6 dimensions. However, people don't show up in silos. They show up as complete integrated human beings. And just like our nervous system and our cardiovascular system and our digestive system have to work together, the same with the leadership system.
So all of what we're talking about with this grounded model is based on data. So we've conducted research with over 600 CEOs across 50 countries. And we've looked at the relationship between each of these dimensions and performance. Each of them independently, so all 6 independently, predict higher levels of performance. Which one would you guess has the strongest predictor of performance? Any ideas? Want to yell it out? Everyone's a bit shy. So emotional was up there, and it was actually spiritual health. So spiritual health, how we view the world. And I know that you were talking about generosity. Generosity of spirit is a part of spiritual health, higher purpose, as Bob mentioned, had the strongest relationship with higher performance. So it opens up a new conversation that we can have with our leaders, which is really exciting.
We also have done this research with our 360 assessment, our grounded leadership, and these findings keep showing up over and over again.
So let's now personalize this a little bit. You have one of our tools that we use in our workshops with leaders and individual contributors. It's called a grounded leader heat map. So it has all the 18 roots we've just talked about. So I want you just to take 15 seconds, just have a look at the map and think about yourself right now. If you had to do a self-assessment, what would you say is the areas that you are healthiest? And which is the area or areas you may be neglecting? Now, keeping that in mind, now I want you to think about the leaders within your organizations and how healthy they are.
What we'd like to do is to do a little poll. And the poll is in the room is to assess how healthy are the leaders in your organization. So what I'd like everybody to do is pull up their phones. And what I'd like for you to do is to go on Slido, S-L-I-D as in dog, O.com, and type in # CLO Houston. And they'll give you a screen, and then I'd like for you to vote on how you would assess the health of the leaders, broadly defined. Leaders broad, not just at the top, but leaders at all levels. How would you define that? Everybody get that? Is that showing up? Okay. Okay, that's good. So this is not unusual. What we often find is that people rate, and we do this with executives as well as managers, and they rate the employees in their organization. It's generally, yeah, we're healthy and unhealthy. Frequently, the unhealthy most of the time is the second most important, and sometimes the first most important. So ask yourself, what's the impact, the business impact of having leaders at all levels not operating on full cylinders on these routes? That's really what we're talking about, because if you are not rooted in this constantly changing world, you will get blown away, blown over by the winds of change. Let's go to the next slide, please. So, if grounded is the foundation, conscious is the accelerant that drives us forward. It helps us adapt faster, because the more conscious we are, the faster we adapt and the higher performing we are. Now, one of the dilemmas, as I mentioned, is that the world is changing faster than our ability to adapt. And the primary culprit is our lack of awareness. Nothing is more important than understanding ourselves and our relationships and the environments in which we live. So we're going to talk a little bit about conscious leadership. But first, Emma-Kate's going to talk about a real paradigmatic challenge that we face.
So why is conscious the new smart? Most of us have grown up being told that if you focus on being smart, you'll advance in the world. So if you go and do an advanced degree or learn a new subject or build a better spreadsheet, you'll continue to be successful in the world. We believe that the obsession with being smart is actually getting in our way of adapting in an accelerating and disruptive world. Now, we believe that being smart is table stakes. If you look around you in your organizations, most of the people are smart. But in order to get ahead, we believe you need to become more conscious. Now, if you think about the smart paradigm starts with a scarcity mindset. There is not enough ideas, knowledge, opportunities to go around. So I'm going to fight for what is rightfully mine. And if I sit in this room and have the best idea, then I'll get a bigger piece of the pie, the budget, the resources, the opportunities. Okay? How much collaboration and sharing of knowledge and helping others learn is going to happen with that mindset? On the other side, we have a conscious mindset where we're actually starting from a place of abundance. We do believe there is enough to go around, enough ideas, knowledge. So we're more likely to share our knowledge and be more generous and be more collaborative. So our obsession with being the smartest in the world, smartest in the room rather, is no longer enough. We believe we need to now move to a higher level of conscious awareness in order to adapt and increase our performance within the current context of our businesses. So what is conscious leadership? Conscious leadership, we define, is awareness in action. However, we are living in a world where we have a bias for action. Okay, so action trumps introspection. Now, on the other hand, there's also some great movement towards introspective practices and pause practices like you talked about yesterday with mindfulness. We believe that the true power of introspection is mastering awareness in action in 3 key areas. First, it's awareness of yourself. So understanding how your thoughts and your feelings impact your actions. The second area is awareness of your relationships. So understanding how others are thinking and feeling and what is the impact of your actions on them. And at the broadest level, it's an outside in and inside out view, is understanding and adapting to our environment. So both the internal organizational forces and the external forces within our environment.
So how conscious are you? Well, actually, research has shown that at any moment in time, only 10 to 15% of people are self-aware. And in our Harris survey, we actually asked people about their executives. 93% of executives in the survey said, oh yes, I'm conscious. But only 50% of people said their executives were conscious. So one of the things that happens is as we move up in our organizations, not only do we believe that we're responsible for the success and other people are responsible for the failure, we also tend not to hold on to our ethical principles. We think that we're better than other people, but also we become less self-aware because there's less information coming up to us. So being self-aware at the top is very important. But of all the leaders that we're talking about CEOs today, this is relevant to people. We could have pictures of people in factories and in offices and individual contributors, and the same principles apply. So, how are we unaware? The first area that we are unaware is that we're simply too shallow. We're too superficial. We don't go deep enough to understand ourselves. We're so intensely wrapped up in movement and action and bullets and outcomes that we don't stop and take a breath. Secondly is we're too narrow in our perspective. We're stuck in steel bunkers and we're shackled by biases and unconscious biases and assumptions that get in the way at the very time that we need to be learning and rethinking the way we do things. Thirdly, we're too safe. We don't take risks. We're afraid of our own power rather than stepping up and sort of going onto the diving board and taking some risks in our lives and in our business. And then lastly, we're too small in our impact. We're not bold enough in the way that we're trying to transform ourselves. And these have huge consequences on individuals, on organizations, and in communities. Look what's happening in our society. More partisanship, more cynicism, less trust, more tensions across racial lines and socioeconomic lines. This is because people are not conscious. They're not conscious of themselves and not conscious of other people. So what does the data show? Well, we've done data with our 360 assessment on thousands of people, and what we found is that the self-aware leaders outperform on these various dimensions. They're able to tap into a higher purpose. They build better relationships. They inspire growth and high performance and the like. So the data also, like Grounded, suggests that self-aware people outperform. So what's the path to being conscious? Well, we think there are 4 practices. The first one is to go deep. The second one is to get to think big. The third one is to get real. And finally, the last one is to step up. So what we'd like to do is to drill down on each of these. First one. First practice is to go deep. We're going to talk about 3 areas of going deep that are really, really important. In a world where the arrows and the threats and the changes are kicking us off center, we need to go deep and understand all of that. This is about looking at yourself in the mirror, making sense of who you are and how the world is affecting you. Now, when we look in the mirror, we often find unclear perceptions about ourselves and others. We find rigid, fixed mindsets. We may find ourselves being hijacked by some of those negative emotions in our amygdala. Or we find that we are not stepping up and we are bringing to our relationships with less healthy, less grounded, less conscious behaviors. Another aspect of going deep is to get comfortable being uncomfortable. You know, we are not taught as children to be uncomfortable. But in fact, in a world of constant change and uncertainty, we are vulnerable by definition. And so we have to embrace that imperfection, allow ourselves to fall down, get comfortable with adversity, and bounce back. There's been some very interesting research that I discovered recently about 15 to 25-year-old adults. And many of them probably are your children. Do you know that research says that if kids in those age brackets don't have a major crisis in their life that they have to manage through, they're at risk at age 45 when the world throws them a real crisis, a real arrow. So we shouldn't be shutting down that learning, and it's the same thing for us as adults. We just need to become comfortable being uncomfortable. And lastly, we've got to leverage our positive emotions, as I talked about. And my favorite example these days is Oprah Winfrey. I mean, teenage mom, goes to AM Chicago, becomes a global sensation with the Oprah Winfrey Show, and she talks about the power, and she's shown us the power of authenticity. She shows up in her life with an open mind and an open heart. And in fact, she recently stated that if she knew how the power of authenticity could make her money, she would have done it much earlier. So Oprah Winfrey is a pretty good example of the importance of going deep.
The second practice is about thinking big. Thinking big is about looking outside of yourself. It's about expanding your mind, and it's about seeing a bigger landscape. Now, thinking big deals directly with our tendency to be too narrow in our thinking. So in a disruptive world, we can be hijacked by our fixed mindsets, our distorted thinking, and our unconscious biases. So thinking big helps you to lead for today and tomorrow simultaneously. It helps you to be more innovative, and it helps you deal and navigate with the level of complexity that we're all having to deal with. So there are 3 tactics that we have identified in terms of developing this capability of thinking big. Being your own drone, developing a Google mind, and leveraging your personal ecosystem. So being your own drone is about stepping back. It's about being able to scan the horizon to see your challenges in a broad perspective, and it's then being able to step back and see your challenges holistically. So it's skills like being able to envisage the past and the future simultaneously, being able to identify trends and patterns outside your industry, and being able to be a participant observer. So for example, you're in a meeting talking about strategy. What are you noticing about how you're showing up? Are you balancing your level of inquiry and advocacy? Are you being open to others' perspectives? Developing a Google mind is then about learning and expanding our mind, learning in real time and expanding our mind. So just like Google's search engine, we have to constantly refresh our mind so we have a multiplicity of perspectives in order to get insight and deal with the level of complexity we're having to focus on. Laszlo Bock, the prior chief people officer of Google, argued that having an MBA is no longer what is most important. It's about developing the skill of learning agility, and this is what we refer to as having a Google mind. Now, not only do we need to expand our mind, we also need to expand our relationships, and this is about leveraging your personal ecosystem. So we need a constant motion of ideas, and we only get that through our networks and our relationships. It's the collaborators and the networkers, the strong networkers and collaborators, who are the ones getting ahead. Getting real is the third practice, and this is about the skill in transforming ourselves. So this deals with the pitfall that we talked about being too safe or stagnant in a constantly changing world. And one of the things that CEOs are constantly saying to us is, how do I transform my business more quickly? And the conversation that we're having is, in order to transform your business, you have to transform the leaders and your employees within the business. So what we'd like to do is just talk about personal transformation just for a moment. Personal transformation happens in the gap between your current state and your desired future. We are either pushed into the gap when we face problems, or we're pulled into the gap when we want to move towards opportunities or set new goals. In the gap is where we have the most discomfort that Bob mentioned, and we try and avoid that discomfort. It's where we have the most anxiety, but it's also where we have the most creativity and change. So what we've noticed is more conscious leaders learn to get comfortable in that gap and navigate the gap. The problem is that in an accelerating and disruptive world, this gap is widening. So what we're needing to do is we're needing to transform ourselves, our teams, and our organisations more quickly. In other words, we need to learn to accelerate across the gap in order to adapt and perform at a higher level. One of the ways that we do this is by what we talk about in our workshops, leveraging your accelerators and managing your personal hijackers. And I love the story of the Double-Wala network in India. It's a 125-year-old food delivery service. They make home-cooked meals that they deliver in lunchboxes to office workers all over Mumbai. Now, it is claimed, and I find this unbelievable, it is claimed that they have less than one mistake in every 6 million deliveries. If we could get that kind of result in our business, can you imagine? And what is their secret? Their secret is they're able to leverage their personal accelerators. And for them, it's about meaning, it's about passion, and it's about their pride in the history and reputation that they've built up over the years. So here are some examples you can see of accelerators. Accelerators are mindsets and beliefs and actions that push us forward and help us be at our best potential as we lead through change. So things like appreciation, some of the things you talked about yesterday, generosity, optimism, focus and practice, and discipline.
Notice that vulnerability is a personal accelerator. Now, if you asked a bunch of men at the top of organizations whether vulnerability was something that they should be evaluated on positively, many of them might not say that this is a really important skill. This is something we need to teach our people, because if not, they're living in a delusion that they're not vulnerable if the world is transforming and disrupting around them. This is an emotional insight that is critical to thrive in uncertainty.
So we all know who this is on this slide. Michael Phelps, and I thought our Aussie swimmers were pretty good until Michael came along. So Michael Phelps, discovered at age 11, at age 15 at the Sydney Olympics, he was the youngest male US swimmer in 68 years to attend the Olympics, and then went on 4 years later in Athens and won 6 gold medals and 2 bronze medals. Another 4 years later in Beijing, he won 8 gold medals. But after that, his world changed, and spiraled down in many ways. And I'm sure, many of us read about his DIUs, drinking under the influence, some of the issues he had with drugs and alcohol and broken relationships. And then he had to actually go to a treatment facility and deal directly with some of his hijackers. So some of his hijackers were his perfectionism and his fixation on success and a need to feel special, which meant that he didn't feel like he was a whole person. None of us can be perfect all of the time. Now, the thing is that he then went on, and we know in Rio in 2016, it's actually a really happy story in the end. He was surrounded by his family, and he went on to win 5 gold medals and 1 silver medal. So someone even like Michael Phelps has both accelerators, his resilience, his focus, his practice, his drive, but also has personal hijackers that got in his way. And we have some examples here. So being overly controlling, being cynical, having distorted thinking, unconscious biases, fixed mindsets, being over-pleasing or perfectionistic. And we take these hijackers and we put them onto some cards in workshops, And we have the leaders sort through and identify what are the hijackers for them. And we have a number of giggles in the room because people can resonate with these, right? I'm sure you can look at the list and resonate with these. So it's interesting, when Bob and I were writing the book together, you know, I don't have any hijackers, but I had to deal with his. No, joking. We had to call each other on our personal hijackers and leverage our accelerators. So Bob can get really overly obsessed with work and he burns himself out. And apparently I have a little bit of a perfectionistic hijacker that he had to call out every now and then. Okay, so it's about building awareness of how these show up and then providing feedback to each other.
We're always in the evolution of being conscious. Did you say a little bit of perfectionism? So now we're going to take
real-time feedback.
Now we're going to take a little poll about which personal hijacker most trips you up. So why don't you take a shot at this, and let's see where folks are. It's amazing how people are really different in terms of the kinds of personal hijackers that they grapple with. And when you link the accelerators and hijackers to real-life business challenges, they're able to see how they get in the way or accelerate their success in their job. So what we have is stress and burnout. This is very common. Now, what's the impact of having a personal hijacker of pleasing others? Does anybody? What's the impact of pleasing others on your job? What's that? Yeah. I mean, you really get in the way of your own power, your own personal power. And if you're spending too much time in someone else's shoes and not enough on your own agenda, then you're not going to get things done. And how about for self-defeating thinking? You know, we introduce a whole list of what we call thinking, what do we call them? Thinking blockers? Thinking errors. They're things like a tendency to generalize from one situation to the world. Or how about the tendency to personalize? Something happens and we think that everybody doesn't like us. Or the tendency to magnify. These are thinking errors. And our mind has the capacity to shift from thinking errors to thinking liberators. So let's talk a little bit about the next slide, which is step up. Can I have the next slide, please? Oh, before we do that. So what happens is that if you become more comfortable and aware of your personal accelerators or hijackers, that influences the way you see, the way you think, the way you feel, and the way you act. But guess what? We take all this learning and we drop it into organizations. And what happens is that organizational accelerators and hijackers undermine the very investments in work that we do in leadership development. And so in many ways, I've felt like the demands for return on investment of our leadership development programs have really not been fair, because we're investing all this time in helping people to become more sturdy and resilient, but then we drop them into organizations where the accelerators like inspiring leaders and open communications and higher purpose are there, but so are the politics, the unhealthy politics and the toxic managers and the closed decision making. So there's lots of stuff in the environment that's undermining us. Takes us to the fourth practice, which is step up. Step up is about being bold. It's about being responsible. It's about being accountable. So one of the first things about stepping up is that we have to become comfortable with anxiety. Anxiety is a fact of life. How we use it makes all the difference. If we have too little anxiety, we live in a world of complacency. If we have too much anxiety, we live in a world of chaos. But just the right amount of anxiety creates the right tension to move forward. I believe that just enough anxiety inside ourselves is the foundation for leading with constructive impatience. In a disruptive and accelerating world, we need our leaders to be constructively impatient. Two leaders, Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, and Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon. Both are constructively impatient leaders, and they're able to create just the right amount of anxiety in their organization. And you know what? They know when to turn up or turn down the heat when there are problems. Secondly is we got to build a shared consciousness. Something happened in Chicago when the Chicago Cubs won the pennant. You know, for 10 or 15 years, we were obsessed with data analytics, and the game became kind of cold and clinical. And Theo Epstein came into Chicago, and he changed that. He says, I need to give the game back to the human being, the players, the team, and the community. And wouldn't you know it, but the exact same thing happened when A.J. Finch came in. It was the coach of the Houston Astros, and the very next year, the Houston Astros won the pennant. They are showing us how to blend data analytics with the human side of business. And we're not there yet. We're coming out of a time when we are obsessed with data, and we need to figure out a better combination of the two. So there you have it. Moving from being shallow, go deep. Too narrow, think big. Too safe, get real. Too small, step up. To us, these are the important capabilities to adapt in a changing world. Now, you all know better than any of us the challenge of how to scale ideas, common messages, and create alignment in the organization around some core capabilities. I just wanted to share a little bit of our experience as we bring grounded and conscious into enterprises. First off, one of the things that we notice is that executives continue to surprise us about how they wake up. They want to talk about their own humanity themselves in a safe environment that holds their anxiety. We also have noticed that there are a ton of ambassadors, operating leaders, and human resource and learning people inside organizations with some certification who are great facilitators of helping groups and teams become grounded and conscious. And then ultimately, as you all know, is how do you use technology to help to support all of this? Common message, strategic alignment. Very, very important. Two quick things. One is we have a little assessment. How conscious are you? And if you want to take that, you can text conscious to 31996 to take the free assessment. And our website is www.healthycompanies.com. And one of the great things that an audience gives is their attention. And for that, we're very grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.